Gorkrad walked with a steady, even gait as he was summoned before the High King of the Elves, his eyes fixed forward. Although he appeared to be paying little heed to the other elves in the hall around him, he was smirking internally at the strange looks they gave him. To them, he must look like a vicious tiger that someone had dressed in fine feathers. Elves have long considered the orcs to be a primitive, simple, barbaric people. Gorkrad considered that this stereotype, strictly speaking, wasn't wrong. However, what the elves failed to understand was that they weren't like this by choice. Their territory in the southeast consisted primarily of barren deserts, frigid mountains, or endless swamps. Despite the elves' propaganda, if not some of their own, the war currently being fought between their people was not because it's simply what orcs do, nor for the glory of battle or any other such nonsense. It, like most wars, was over resources. At length, Gorkrad reached the front of the audience chamber, ensuring to keep his eyes fixed forward with a look of indifference on his face, even as he internally marveled at it. It was big, almost wastefully so, and highly adorned. The precious metals and jewelry intricately inlaid into the walls and pillars, and even the very floor upon which he walked, weren't excessively gaudy. But in a room this size, there was still enough of them to sustain an entire orc town for a generation. Once he arrived before the Elves' High King, Gorkrad gave a quick, simple bow of respect, before returning to an upright posture. This set off many whispers throughout the hall, as apparently it was considered a grave offense. Gorkrad knew that it was common practice among the elves to kneel before the High King, or at least give a deep bow and remain so until told to rise. However, those were the king's subjects, not his enemies. Even the small bow he gave was, by orc standards, showing more reverence than necessary. For his part, the High King merely waved it off without comment. Gorkrad chafed slightly at the thought that the High King likely believed him to be too simple-minded to know proper protocol, rather than seeing the gesture for what it was. However, that wasn't important. If the king wished to see him as simple-minded, so be it. No, Gorkrad had a far more important reason for being here today, and he was hoping to get right to it. "Tell me, emissary of the orcs." The High King leaned over as one of his advisors whispered something into his ear. This wasn't looking promising. "Chieftain Aide Gorkrad, why have you come here? Your people are at war with us, yes? There seems to be little for us to talk about, unless you have come to offer terms of your surrender." "I am not, your majesty," Gorkrad said, in a calm, even tone, despite feeling a hint of concern. That the king waited to learn the name of an envoy from the enemy's camp until after the talks began was certainly an insult, but one that Gorkrad could ignore. As was his jest about offering terms of surrender, despite the fact that the orcs had been winning the war with the elves. What bothered Gorkrad was that it potentially spoke to a level of indifference, or even blind arrogance, in the Elven High King. That would not bode well if it proved to be the case. "So then, why is one such as yourself here?" The High King lounged back on his throne, appearing nonchalant, belying the dominating tone of his voice. "Well, your majesty?" Gorkrad had practiced for this dozens of times, but in the moment he had the slightest bit of trouble finding the right words. "It has come to the attention of our people that some in your court have considered petitioning the humans for aid." The High King still sat back nonchalantly on his throne, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly at this, and his tone became cold. "And what of it?" "We believe that, for both of our people, this would be an error," he answered. The High King raised an eyebrow, seemingly curious, but said nothing. Gorkrad took a gamble, believing the silence was permission to continue. "Permit me to tell you a story, if it may please your majesty." The High King dismissively waved. Gorkrad continued. "As you know, the Orc tribes have raised an army of no less than 60,000 warriors for the present conflict, and that's only our land combatants." Gorkrad conveniently ignored that their navy was almost non-existent, but the High King didn't seem to notice or care. He wasn't sure which. "Yes, we're aware. What of it?" Annoyance entered the High King's voice. Was this backwater tuskless pig trying to threaten him? Of course, Your Majesty. However, what you might not be aware of is that a little over 10 years ago we raised an army almost 3 times the size. Over 150,000 troops. Whispers filled the hall, along with a few gasps. Gorkrad paused as the High King stared at him for a moment, then raised his hand slightly. The whispers instantly went silent. After raising this army, we loaded onto ships and set off to Altera, to the human continent. More whispers, but this time Gorkrad continued over them. The continent, as you are no doubt aware, is overrun with wild magic, or what you elves call malignant magic. Few humans have any connection to the spirits at all, and for those that do is often tenuous at best. Yet on this continent, beset by creatures whose only desire is to tear out the throats of sapiens, and whose abilities are fortified by the abundance of such magic, humans have not only survived, but thrived. Perhaps if our leaders at the time had considered what that meant, we would not have committed the greatest mistake our people had ever made. What do you mean? The High King demanded. He was still leaning back in his throne, but the twitch of his muscles told Gorkrad it was forced. He didn't want to seem too eager to hear the rest of this lowly orc's tale. We had some information about where we would land. A small kingdom on the coast, one that was already in pitched combat with its neighbour. Or neighbours. They were apparently part of some alliance, so there were actually multiple kingdoms fighting each other. Still, we knew that the bulk of their military was on the front of this conflict, and they would not be expecting our attack from behind. They would only be able to call upon a small reserve and poorly, if at all, trained militias, and could only equip them with outdated weapons and armour. This occurred precisely as we foresaw. They tried to delay us, to buy time for other forces to come to their aid, but we were finally able to force them into a pitched battle, and it was a massacre. The High King frowned. Taking glory in slaughtering the weak and helpless? Truly barbaric. Gorkrad shook his head. No, Your Majesty. I didn't say they were massacred. A look of confusion and disbelief briefly flashed on the High King's face, before he could stop it, as whispers of a similar nature filled the room. Gorkrad ignored them and continued. 150,000 trained and battle-tested orcs against poorly trained and equipped humans who weren't even a quarter of our number, and we were slaughtered almost to the man. To this day, those few survivors can barely speak of what happened without trembling in fear. You expect me to believe this? The High King scoffed, but confusion gripped him. Had it been the other way around, it would obviously have been a lie, but why would the orc lie about this? Especially apparently knowing that the elves were considering seeking aid from the humans. Gorkrad continued. As I said before, humans have little connection to magic, yet their continent is overrun by monsters. They had to find other means to combat them. They develop weapons that unleash a bellow that rivals thunder, and spits a projectile from clear across the horizon accurately onto the heads of their enemies. But these projectiles are no mere rocks or arrows. They explode, creating a fireball and shockwave that shreds all who are unfortunate enough to be beneath it. They created devices that turn the ground itself into a fireball, should you step on the wrong spot. But the worst of it? The worst came from those few who managed to make it into the humans' trenches, and somehow made it out of that hell again. Those who did so, who faced the hellish landscape leading to those trenches and made it in, say that hell itself would flinch in the face of what they witnessed. Humans, fighting desperately for survival, using knives, rocks, clubs, hammers, anything and everything they could get their hands on. And when they couldn't, their hands alone sufficed. The story that I remember most was one where a man told me of watching a human beheading one of his friends with a shovel. A shovel! Not a precision weapon, but a tool for digging in the earth. His friend was brought low by a single swing, but it took many, many more to take his head. By the end, he was begging the human to kill him, as the human was focusing all of his energy on attempting to do just that, and it took many more strikes to succeed in doing so. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Out of the corner of his eye, Gorkrat saw several of the elves assembled shiver, even among the guards. Indeed, it was disconcerting to imagine the pain of being beheaded by a tool that would barely even classify as a bludgeoning weapon. If this is all true, the High King spoke at length, apparently giving up on trying to appear nonchalant and gracing Gorkrat with a thoughtful appearance instead, then I can see why the orc tribes would be against the consideration some of our people have of petitioning the humans for aid. However, nothing you stated suggests that it would be problematic for us. If anything, they will be extra motivated to deal with your kind, as the orcs attempted to invade their home. Because after the humans defeat us, and they will defeat us, Your Majesty, and they will do so without much effort, there will only be one enemy left, Gorkrat answered. You are the enemy, the High King responded. The only enemy. Gorkrat shook his head, then asked with a knowing expression, Tell me, Your Majesty, have you ever heard of the race of people called the Chimer? The High King didn't respond, but glanced over at his advisor, who shook his head, then looked back at Gorkrat. Naturally, he couldn't say he hadn't. It wouldn't do for a king to admit their ignorance. It's not surprising. After all, you elves don't really believe in recording, let alone studying history. You live such long lives that there's no need to. If something is deemed important, it's passed down verbally. If not, 200-300 years is ancient history to us, but to you is practically yesterday. But for as long-lived as your people are, you're not immortal. 200 or 300 years ago? That's recent, but 2,000 or 3,000? Your people are practically blind to what occurred so long ago. The High King's eyes narrowed, letting a hint of annoyance gleam in them, but Gorkrat continued. We orcs are not so long-lived. We do not possess the fragment of the divine, as your people call it, that allows you to live such long lives. We instead have to keep records of our past, and successive generations must study them. Coincidentally, this is a practice that we picked up from humans. Not 10 years ago, but ages before that, when all of the 4 races lived here, on Elterra. Confusion was evident on the face of the High King, and the gathered crowd, as they all waited for what Gorkrat would say next. The Chimer were driven to extinction, the orcs to the southeastern wastes, and the humans were driven into exile on the northern continent. Tell me, Your Majesty, who benefited from this? Gorkrat let just a hint of sarcasm drip from his lips. Who suffered? And who exactly might the humans seek vengeance upon for actually driving them from their home?